Hi, so everyone, thanks for coming. I'm really excited to talk about this. For the past 3, 4 years, basically, I've been researching and entirely immersed in scallops. And this is kind of the culmination of everything, which my ultimate goal was to grow the scallop industry in Maine. And so I've titled this Automation in the Scallop Industry. But this seminar is going to be split into kind of two sections. First, about 30 minutes talking a little on the research, the stuff that me as a biologist and a researcher really enjoy. But then about 15 minutes presenting this sort of toolkit we created, ideally to help growers and industry members sort of refine their farming ideas and business strategy. And the idea was we kind of made something that's a little less more of a spreadsheet and a little more of an application so that when you're just kind of thinking, and hopefully some people in here are thinking, maybe I should grow some scallops. This toolkit is kind of designed for you. People that don't know a ton about scallop growing, but they're interested and just kind of want to see like, how could I make this work? If I'm an oyster farmer, could I grow a small batch of scallops? Can I do it? Like, can I make this work with other scenarios? Do I need to start a farm of my own? And so that will take about 15 minutes, and then I'm hopefully not going to talk too long, and we can have about 15 minutes at the end for questions, or if people actually want to go through a scenario they've been thinking about in their heads, we can hopefully use the tool for that. So first off, automation in the scallop industry, just rolling right into this. Automation in general is kind of this double-edged sword. On one hand, it has the potential to really reduce a lot of the labor involved, particularly here in the US, where labor requirements are fairly high for aquaculture and are often kind of the major expense of a lot of farms. On the other hand, the more complex your machines get, usually the more expensive they get, the more maintenance is required. And it's one thing I noticed when I kind of first started doing research in Maine is that really all the automation in the world, the best thing out there is the human spine. If you can ever replicate and automate cheaply enough the human spine, like that's the day every aquaculture farm just goes straight to automation. But for now, we kind of have to work with these machines and hopefully to kind of limit and balance it, right? So, for people here that haven't lived, eaten, breathed scallops, which I often forget, not everyone does because they're the coolest of the bivalves, in my opinion. I'm just going to give a quick, brief introduction. So, scallop farming is a pretty new player in the game. Really, it only started in about the 1960s, compared to oysters, which have been farmed since ancient Greece, or even mussels that have had about like 500 years of aquaculture history. Scallops started about the 1960s. They're not really an easy animal to farm when you look at things like oysters. Oysters are basically rocks. They're really robust. They can actually close and survive several days out of water. They have a lot of advantages for growing, but scallops are a little more fickle. One thing that's pretty notable about them is they have to remain in the water column. Unlike an oyster that can completely close and kind of stay like that for several, days, even a week potentially, or sit in your fridge for 2 weeks. A scallop actually will die if it spends about up to a couple hours out of water. Um, Additionally, it's always kind of hard to collect the spat too. Oysters will cement and settle onto substrate. Scallops are pretty resistant to hatcheries. So the biggest kind of breakthrough in scallop farming happened in the 1960s when they came up with this. We call it a really simple innovation, but in my head, it's brilliant. Basically, a Japanese fisherman took a spat collector, which is just a convoluted mesh of material that spats settle on, and oysters settle on it, mussels settle on it, and when they settle on it, they cement, so you can collect that later. But scallops, since they don't cement and adhere to it, they actually will fall off, so you can't collect them. So all they did was they just put an onion bag over this mesh material, which everyone thinks of like, wow, it's so simple. But in reality, it was just a huge innovation. And so the Japanese began cultivating the Hokkaido scallops, and the growth was pretty phenomenal. So since the 1960s here, you can see this little graph. This is by decade. We've seen total production of scallops rise just drastically. To this point, there actually is more scallops being produced than mussels. Oysters are still doing pretty well, but when we really look at the next slide, and we see global scallop aquaculture by nation, it's really scallops are only farmed in a few nations. It's really a difficult and finicky animal, But what we see is that when a nation does, or an area kind of does get the knack for it, the growth is explosive. And it's really interesting to me that we're actually even seeing this level of competition on the scallop industry with these other global shellfish industries, despite the fact that it's really only being grown in China, Japan, Peru, and South Korea. But all these other nations that I have listed in yellow are all doing research and trying to get a slice of that pie. And so that's kind of what we're doing here. Now, to grow scallops, simple is best, right? Simplicity is kind of what I learned overall, the key in aquaculture, particularly with your growth medium. So, just to set it up, like I said, get some background. Uh, Basically, scallops are grown on something called a suspended long line, usually. Over on the right of this picture, if you're looking at the screen, you see bottom seeding. You can grow scallops on the bottom. They do it in Japan, and then dredge them up, similar to how you do oysters. But it's going to be really difficult here in the US to ever get that actually working. And then over here, ear hanging lantern nets and pearl nets. These are just ways of fixing scallops in the water column. So all they've done is they've created a suspended long line that usually hangs between 5 and 15 feet under the water, attached with buoys. Very similar to surface culture oysters, except like I said, just kind of suspended in the water. Um, and you can see there's three kind of methods using these things called pearl nets. That's on the left. These are sort of blue triangular nets, generally used for growing smaller scallop seed. Lantern nets were just these multi-tiered cylindrical mesh nets that you can throw scallops into and grow them in the water column. And then finally, ear hanging, which was kind of a focus of our research here. This was developed by the Japanese and is really reliant on a lot of heavy automation. And they all have their advantages and disadvantages. So, scallop aquaculture in Maine, what does it look like right now? Um, we've seen some interest in scallop aquaculture for about 20 years, and prior to me coming in, most of it was done in lantern nets, and you can see me holding one right there. That's a really clean lantern net. It's a pretty simple innovation. If you know anything, a lot of times people kind of poo-poo lantern nets. They talk about how they're just a pain to work with, and they absolutely are. But they still are a really effective culture method for sea scallops. So there's nothing wrong with lantern nets, even though we're looking at different um, technologies, but there is some hurdles to overcome. Number one here in Maine is our fouling. We just have some of the most heinous fouling out there, it seems, particularly in the summer months. And unlike oysters that we can desiccate on the surface, scallops have to remain in the water, right? You can't keep them out of the water, as I said earlier, for more than really a few hours. And in the heat of the summer, probably you don't want to have them out of the water for more than 30 minutes. And this leaves you open to a lot of labor, and if you don't maintain your farm, a lot of excess labor dealing with these lantern nets. The one that I'm holding on the left that's clean is probably 10 pounds, and the ones on the right that have the top one we actually I should write a paper on. We actually seeded with kelp unintentionally. But those are about 200 to 300 pounds. So they're quite labor intensive to work with. There are ways of getting around this. You could build a frame. This actually isn't even my idea. Oysters were originally grown in lantern nets way back in the day here in Maine when they first started it before surface culture was really popular. So we actually took this idea to build a frame, and you can desiccate them and kind of rotate them out on the water. There's also automated technologies they're looking at. This is a machine where you can kind of run the lantern net through, but it's still quite a bit of labor. Additionally, you're kind of getting a lot of gear here. So, in your head, just really quickly, a lantern net's cool. You put about 10 scallops in per lantern net tier, and there's 10 tiers. And so if you really run those numbers out and you say like, oh, I want to grow 100,000 scallops, which, full-time job, if you can sell a scallop for $2 a scallop, $200,000 a year annual income, that's pretty good. But that's about 1,000 lantern nets. And right here on this picture, I think we have about 40 stacked up. So, you're really running into this kind of gear load, and these are probably about $35 a pop now. So that's a hefty initial investment just to even get started in these lantern nets that's going to quickly expand unless you have some sort of space. Um, So that's kind of the good and the bad of lantern nets. I think a lot of people here have probably seen them. Like I said, they're still used. China uses them, and China has 86% of the global scallop production. So they're still very much a useful technology. Um, but next we have this other technology called ear hanging. So ear hanging was developed in Japan, and it was actually the first way they started farming scallops. But it has a significant advantage over lanternettes. All we do in ear hanging is we take these scallops, and instead of putting them in a tier, we just affix them to these dropper lines. And you can see a farmer holding some up right there, and these paired couplets, and you can see them sitting underwater. This has some significant advantages over the lantern nets. One of them, which we studied initially, and I'm not going to really get into the specifics of the study, is improved growth. Um, so for about 2 years, we compared lanternette and ear hanging culture, and we saw that because you could kind of keep ear hanging scallops sort of separate from each other, you didn't have any of these density considerations. That's one issue I kind of forgot to mention in the lanternettes is, you can only have about 10 scallops at the end in a lanternette tier in order to keep sort of maximizing growth. Um, if you put more in, they actually start to see pretty reduced growth quickly, which may or may not be an issue, kind of depending on your business strategy. But in ear hanging, everything is a fix. So ultimately, we did some kind of fancy modeling, and we found that there was a 4 to 11% improved adductor growth, which matches the similar to the kind of the Japanese comparisons as well. We were pretty happy with that. And you find that you get, a 21 adductor per pound count after 3 years on the farm. This is kind of one of those things where it maybe doesn't look that impressive, but when you really consider if you're selling adductors by the pound, 10% improved profit margin is huge in any business. So that was definitely an interesting thing to look at. But we also see that the shell height, which for those in the scallop know, whole scallops are kind of an interesting market comparison. We see shell height really didn't have this massive growth improvement. And sorry, I just see a lot of chat stuff, and I want to. Okay, cool. All right. So I just want to, so we notice the shell height really isn't that different, honestly, between these two, which is kind of an interesting consideration if you're looking at it and maybe looking to sell whole scallops. But if you're looking to sell adductor product by the pound, ear hanging was pretty prime. Uh, the other advantage of ear hanging, and I'm hoping we're going to get these fun videos, is the automation ability of it. Ear hanging, because it's so much simpler than lantern net culture, is really primed for automation. And so, as you noticed, thinking about drilling those scallops, it sounds like a lot of labor, right? And it is. And I'm really hoping this is going to work. So this is how it was initially done in Japan. This is just a little Dremel machine, and you sit there and just monotonously drill each shell and put them on a dropper line, right? It's very labor intensive, it's very boring. But we also can further automate this. So this is an automatic drilling machine. And this machine essentially you just put them in there and it automatically drills and puts them up. Still kind of labor intensive. But then over here on the right, I don't have a video of this one, unfortunately. You actually see a fully automated machine. So this machine, you put them in and it just drills and pins. Now, in your head, you may be thinking, all right, well, the lanternets are just so much easier because you can throw them in. But really, this is a front loading process. So by putting these on the dropper lines, you're actually opening yourself up to much less labor, particularly from biofouling control in the future, because we still get biofouling, similar to the lanterns, but as you can see, there's much less surface area. You're just seeing more fouling on the shells. Obviously, you don't want to be selling that scallop, especially as a whole product. So it still needs to be clean, but we're actually able to automate even that. So sorry about that. So this is a scallop washing machine, right? That simplicity of the dropper line setup, and really also keep in mind this is a lot cheaper. Instead of $35 for a lantern net to hold 100 scallops, you can put about 150 scallops on a dropper line, which is probably $5 tops. So here we can see this washing machine that really quickly and easily automates it. I had the opportunity to go out and work on a boat, and we ended up basically cleaning the entire scallop farm in 1 day using this machine. Went through something like 700 dropper lines. So it really makes the process quite a bit easier. And that's the advantage of ear hanging. So we have these kind of interesting balances between lanternette and ear hanging from an economic perspective. We saw this growth increase. That was really cool from a biologist perspective, but we really wanted to ask kind of how would this work economically, right? Because these machines I just showed you, really cool, fun videos, but are they actually going to be cost effective? At the end of the day, we wanted to really ask, like, if you were to pay, I think those cleaning machines can run, between 20 and $70,000. They're custom machines. They come from Japan. You have to put the plastic pins in the line. You have to get the drilling machine. You have to get the cleaning machine. You have to get a sorting machine sometimes. You might have to get a power pack so you can power these machines on your boat. You're really looking at a pretty hefty initial investment of, $300,000 or more just to even get started in the scallop farming game if you're looking at ear hanging. Versus lantern nets, yeah, they're expensive, they're labor intensive. But, if you're looking to run a smaller operation or just kind of supplement your operation with scallops, maybe it's a worthwhile investment. So we asked two questions, and this is how I'm going to really set it up is we asked a research question, and research is by nature somewhat limited when you actually look at the application of it. In order for us, the goal of a researcher is to kind of take all this data and all this really complex things we're looking at and sort of distill it down into one or two numbers, a couple points, so that we can get these really valuable trends, but not necessarily things that are going to be applicable to every single person. So, I've split this into two questions. We have a research question, which is given our available data, which was our study set that we looked at using the scallop growers we know, what scallop culture system produces the highest return on investment? Ear hanging or lantern net culture? But there's an applied question here too. And this question is really what we want to see researching aquaculture is what system would be the most optimal for specific instances outside of our data range. So a grower can read my paper and they can definitely glean interesting facts from ear hanging and lantern net culture. But the question is, really, can they apply it to themselves? And that's my ultimate goal as an aquaculture researcher. So we're going to look at both these questions. First, we're going to look at the research question. And the research question is, once again, taking all these different ideas, lantern net culture, ear hanging, automation, and really formulating a few questions and a few research options for us to look and kind of see how these all work together. One of the final questions up here on the right is kind of a big question is, do we sell the adductor product or do we sell the whole scallop as well? That kind of adds a whole new layer. Previously, a lot of research has focused on just the whole scallop, but the adductor has a lot of value as well. And then finally, we added a new component in this research that I was kind of excited about, and we looked at another thing, which was weather. We could scale our process in the modeling, of course, up to millions of scallops, but realistically, you only have so many days in a year, and weather limits that even further. You don't want to be working all the time in the winter. And so we actually used some oceanographic data to kind of determine how much you could actually farm using both of these methods as well. And that became a metric for our research question. And we took all this into account and we crafted these three scenarios. So scenario one, we compared ear hanging and lantern net culture, and we compared them after 3 and 4 years of harvesting. And then we also compared a whole scallop and adductor only production. Scenario two, we kind of looked at the effects of seasonal harvest timing on ear hanging culture, and we compared the whole and adductor only. And then scenario three, we looked at the impact. We looked at the impacts of automated pinning on ear hanging, and we tested two assumptions, which was this sole and cooperative ownership. So when I talk about pinning, I'm talking about those videos I showed where you had the Dremel, which really you could maybe do 3,000 scallops a day on that. There was the automated pinning machine, which is pretty efficient. You can get through 12,000 scallops a day. And then the fully automated machine, where you are actually limited by the machine itself, and you can only do about 10,000 scallops a day, but you only need one person to just run that machine. And we also tested these sole and cooperative ownership models. So the idea is that whether it's maybe instead of buying all these machines yourselves, you and 10 other people in your watershed kind of get together and purchase them as well. So 300,000 becomes $30,000, and then you split maintenance and time and potentially even labor. And this cooperative ownership model is something we've seen in Japan through some of our technology transfers. So just moving in, we're going to talk about graphs and we're going to get into the research, but I promise we'll eventually get into actually how to set up a scallop farm in a minute. So first thing we did, I talked about the weather days, is we established our maximum annual production unit. And so this was basically just using a weather buoy. We set a hard cap of, I think, 25 knots. So if the sustained winds were 25 knots during the day, we said total average weather, we said you can't work in that. So the total average weather days a year came out to be about a month, 37 days, plus or minus 11 days a year. You pretty much just couldn't go out and work. We subtracted weekend days because ideally, this is a farm, you want to make a living and you also want to see your family. And we ended up coming up with really you could only work and your maximum production unit needed to be bounded by 234 days of labor per year, right? And I think that's a pretty fair assessment. And immediately, we saw a difference between ear hanging and lantern net culture. So this is just a proportion of labor days and showing where the labor breakdown is coming. And we see that these lantern nets, just through cleaning, have just so much more, drastically more labor. Looking at this production unit, I think this is a 4-year production cycle. So you're growing these scallops on your farm for 4 years, and you see that the most of your labor is actually going towards cleaning. Here in ear hanging, you see that you have that front loading, right, where you have to do the ear hanging pinning. But right here, the cleaning labor goes way down, and allowing you to spend more time on harvesting and ultimately actually farming more scallops. So let's look at these scenarios. These are going to be graphs, like I said. I'm going to try to break these down as best I can, but if you have questions, feel free to chime in. So scenario one I talked about, we have this kind of 4-plot graph looking at 3 years of culture versus 4 years of culture for your scallops on farm, and looking at the adductor only product and the whole scallop product. And so I'm going to actually push this little spotlight so I can showcase it. So yeah, adductor only, whole scallop only, and then 3 and 4 years of culture. And so we just kind of immediately looking at these graphs, like on the bottom here, this is your production level. So this is how many scallops you're producing. And on the top here, this is kind of what you can sell your scallops for. And this BE10, just really quickly explaining it, is a metric to basically look at if you sold every scallop or every pound of adductors or kilogram of adductors at a specific price to essentially break even after 10 years, this is what you'd have to sell it at. So after 10 years on the farm, you would have to sell each scallop or scallop adductor at this price the entire time in order to have zero. Nope. Snooze that. And I really hope, okay, my computer says it's about to restart, so I'm really hoping that's not going to happen. Sorry. And so here you can see, we noticed some really quick trends already. First off, comparing the years across the years, we can see it in both. We see that it doesn't really the length of time doesn't impact the production you can have here. You can produce about 400,000 scallops with ear hanging after 3 years, and 390,000 scallops after 4 years. So one more year on the farm, despite seeing a growth from about a 20 count to a 10 count meat, which is pretty substantial. You don't actually see a loss in production effort with ear hanging just by nature of that reduced cleaning effort. But lantern nets, it's a different story. You see here at about 300,000 scallops after 3 years is your maximum production unit, but that shortens down to about, I think, 220,000 scallops. So you're actually reducing the amount of product you can produce after 4 years. The next thing is if we compare the adductor only and whole scallops, and we really see here that the ear hanging really benefits from a longer grow out time. We see that ear hanging is significantly better, and particularly when you're looking at the adductor product as well. Here in the whole scallops, we're actually not seeing this huge difference in sales due to lantern nets, and that's a combined factor of the improved growth of the adductor, along with uh, along with the process being a lot more simple for the ear hanging. Another thing to note too is we compared lease size acreage and we found that ear hanging was a lot more space efficient just because you can hang these dropper lines so close together. We found that even at the maximum production unit, you're gonna have a much higher lease size of about like 35 acres for lantern nets, versus about 27 acres for ear hanging. So it's a lot more space efficient. So it definitely, if you're looking to scale your scallop farming operation, ear hanging is pretty much going to be a better option. Next, we looked at timing. Timing is always everything. And all we did here was we kind of just assumed quarterly harvesting starting from 2 years on the farm to 4.25 years on the farm. And we looked at the maximum production unit, which, like I said, is the weather limited amount you can harvest. And then we also kind of looked here at a standardized production unit of 300,000 scallops to kind of see what that comparison was between them. And so when we look at a whole scallop product, which this graph is showing, we don't see too much interesting here. We just see a steady increase in what you're going to have to sell each scallop at in order to make ends meet because you're putting more labor into it the longer you have it on the farm. The only interesting thing we see here is before that ear hanging process, you can actually be growing about 500,000 scallops. So that's kind of what that ear hanging labor process does, is it reduces your overall production ability to about 400,000 by about 100,000 scallops. The next thing we noticed is when you actually begin to look at the adductor market is this maximum production unit and standardized production unit. Once you get to about 4 years with mortality, and as the growth begins to slow at 4 years old, you're actually seeing negative returns. So this is an interesting graph because when you see selling the adductor, remember you're losing scallop product. You're also taking on higher risk the longer you have that on the farm of a mass mortality event. But so as you're growing scallops, you kind of have to balance that with the idea of like, oh, I'm getting better growth. I'm getting a higher count per pound. Perhaps I'm even getting a premium from these scallops. But right here at about 4 years, kind of the end of our study, we actually begin to see negative return on investment. So theoretically, if you grow your scallops even further to say 4.5 years or 5 years, unless you're getting a premium on those scallops, you're actually going to be losing money on that operation, is what our studies results showed. And finally, scenario three, we look at this. We looked at the cooperation and automation, and we ended up coming with this just general theme of small scale cooperate, large scale automate. So this kind of just runs ear hanging automation costs. Here we see on the right this Dremel automated drilling and fully automated drilling systems. The Dremel low cost about $3,000. That's not too bad, but 450 scallops an hour about is what your total output's going to be. This medium cost 25,000. You're going to have about 12,000 scallops per hour or per day. Yeah, per hour. I think per day actually. Sorry. And then finally this fully automated, which is only going to be about 10,000 scallops. I think a day is actually what that's supposed to be. And we broke it down along the entire time scale, and then we kind of zoomed in. So the red box is the comparison at small scale, and the blue box is the comparison at large scale. And we just noticed some really interesting trends here. First off, if you're cooperating, that's this sort of blue circles. We see here that it kind of reduces your costs by a somewhat significant margin. We didn't really change anything here. So it's just important to note that like this isn't a real world scenario. This is a model. The comparison is the key, not necessarily the cost. And we see that at small scale, cooperative farms were pretty successful. That's these circles, and sole ownership was quite a bit more expensive. And we also interestingly see that the Dremel drilling was still a little more expensive, but in a sole ownership model, it was actually less expensive. So if you were going to kind of work on your own, a Dremel is going to be ideal for these sort of small scale farms. But at the higher end of the scale, so 400,000 at our maximum production unit, we saw that first off, the Dremel in green here, you aren't able to actually produce as much, right? You're limited by your overall labor. So you're only able to grow about 310,000 scallops with your Dremel system. just because you're limited by that sort of labor cap. Meanwhile, the automated systems kind of had a very similar labor load and kind of similar price at the end here. We also just see that Dremels, whether it's cooperative or sole, become more expensive just because you're putting more effort into labor to pay people to do all this work. All right, so that's the first half. If anyone has any questions, feel free to interrupt me now. But if not, I'm gonna move into the second half, which is, I showed you these cool graphs, these cool models. These are really valuable. They show a good comparison, right? And they have value, but it requires a little bit of interpretation on your part to use it if you're looking to apply these things. You kind of have to look at it and say, is this going to be the best option for me? We had several assumptions that we couldn't invalidate. So things like we assumed that you had to buy your vessel. So about $120,000 of this model, of the initial expenditures in your first year, went to a vessel. Ooh, one second, let me just check the chat. All right. So yeah, about $120,000 went to buying a new vessel to work your farm. And we just kept these all the same, because that's the easiest way to model it, and it's the easiest way to glean these comparisons. But that's not going to work for everyone. So we wanted to take this model that we built and create an application where people could take it and they could make their own scallop farm in a way. And that was our applied question. And these exist. We have things, and I'm actually just gonna like go out of presentation mode now, and we're gonna go we're gonna just really go way out there, and we're gonna start looking at these. So we've created scientists. I'm not the first person to think of creating financial planning tools. Some of you have probably already seen them, and they're really valuable. And they usually look like this. This is a kelp model I was just sitting in. Oh. I just actually sat in a seminar for this a few months ago. This is developed by the New Hampshire Sea Grant, and this is a kelp financial planning tool. And it's really cool. It's really powerful. They did a ton of great work on this, but I just quickly realized that people immediately shut off. And really, it's a difficult tool to just run into if you're sitting there like, oh, I want to grow some kelp. Well, where do you even start? They have these, spreadsheets, these operating expenses, and really coming into this, you might not have a clue how much you want to grow. And that was kind of the case when we were going through this seminar talking about this. They asked some people in the room who are interested in growing kelp, and they said, all right, how much, let's start. Like, how much kelp do you want to grow? And someone said, first answer was like 10,000 pounds of kelp. And, that sounds great, but anyone here that's a kelp farmer knows that 10,000 pounds of kelp is not going to get you anywhere, really.
Hey,
It's,
Chris,
yeah, sorry.
so sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt you. We have someone raising their hand. So, Hugh,
yeah,
if you are around, I'm gonna unmute you if you want to have a question to ask for Chris.
yeah,
Allowed to
yeah.
talk.
Shoot, shoot.
I was just gonna say there's a there's a pop-up thing on your screen that's
Oh,
blocking your slides.
oh, I'm sorry, Hugh. I'm actually like really trying to get rid of it, but it seems the University of Maine system is trying to get me to update my computer
Oh,
by
all right, it's
force.
just blocking some of the content we
I'm,
can't see, and
ah,
also the
I'm,
the chat was not working, so I don't know if that's been changed.
oh, well, yeah. So, I don't want to mess with it too much, Hugh, because I don't want to accidentally restart my computer. So I'm really sorry about that, everyone. If you can't see anything, please just let me know. But it looks like it's really going to force me to do it. So it's a University of Maine system. It's not my fault. I'm sorry. Um,
And Hugh, the Q&A function should be functioning. The chat is intentionally turned off, but the Q&A function should be working. But let me know if it's not. Go ahead, Chris.
yeah. So yeah. And like I said, thanks for mentioning that, Hugh. I was worried you guys were all seeing that, but I really have been trying to click it and I actually just cannot get rid of it. Unless I restart. Um, So yeah, these are really powerful, but yeah, it's difficult from a new grower perspective, I think, often to look at these and to really begin to start it. And you definitely want to be looking at these as you start a scallop or a kelp farm or any of these farms. These are valuable tools for your business planning. but they're not great for just starting and for kind of considering new scenarios and new ideas. And we actually even have a tool available that my predecessor, Stuart Coleman, made that's really valuable for scallops. And it's a similar tool, really valuable, really powerful, really specific. So this is our sea scallop aquaculture budgeting tool, and hopefully the slides can be shared if anyone's interested. But you can find this on a few of the sites. It's a spreadsheet again. This is nice because it actually sets in sort of these ideal numbers initially. But it just immediately my experience talking to a lot of growers is that these kind of are overwhelming at first. So we kind of went to the drawing board and we created this application. And if anyone has any interest, I'm going to quickly just uh, talk about a little bit about it and put this up here. If anyone wants to look, there's a QR code. If you want to try it real quick, I'm going to give about a minute here while I talk about it. So I teamed up with a programmer and we used our modeling approach from the code and we designed it specifically to put this into the Scallop Farm app. And the idea is this application isn't going to be necessarily as accurate as those two spreadsheets I just showed you, but it's really powerful for quickly and efficiently testing comparisons of your assumptions between different farm ideas. It's really easy for me to update in the code. And right now there's so few scallop farmers that honestly, if you just send me an email, I'm more than happy to kind of work with you through it and create a more customizable app for you as well. I actually live in California right now, and I'm interested in starting a scallop farm out here. And I actually use this app and just kind of shifted a few things slightly to put together my business plan. But the important thing is that this is just a really, really uh, mutable tool. And so, with that in mind, we're going to kind of take a look at it. I'm just going to go over some of the functionality and features. So, if you click on the link, this is the tool. Build your scallop farm. It's less spreadsheet and it's got 4 panes. There's primary inputs, there's secondary inputs, farm at a glance, and then detailed metrics. So these primary inputs, when we were designing them, the idea was to make these as simple as possible. These are the first things you're thinking about in your business, ideally. Maybe these are the things where you're in a bar having a drink and you're like, I should start a scallop farm. And where do I start? And these are kind of the things you probably write down on a napkin. How do I want to do it? What cultures do I want to use? When do I want to start it? How many employees do I think I'm going to need? Do I want to have a boat? Do I need to buy a boat or do I own a boat? These secondary inputs moving into it are looking at things that maybe you don't know. So these are designed to kind of be a little more the nitty gritty. And they have pre-entries based on our research. So based on our model, we've entered everything kind of based on grower feedback. But these are things you probably aren't going to know when you're sitting in the bar starting a scallop farm, and you're actually probably not even going to know until you get on the farm and sort of begin to refine it. So these can be adjusted for sure, um, but not necessarily. You're not necessarily going to know this stuff right away, but you can play around with them a little bit in your head. The next is this farm at a glance, and like I said, I'm so sorry about the pop up in the lower right corner. Um, this farm at a glance is just kind of 3 panes of really easy to understand and ideally easy to digest metrics. Oh, sweet. Okay, I can move it. Sorry, guys. I just found out I can move that pop-up. Really easy to digest metrics. So kind of the most important things we think you need to know, and that growers kind of have also told me that are pretty valuable to know. So the labor costs broken down by season, the cost of goods sold broken down into like equipment, consumables, fuel, labor, maintenance. This is your fixed overhead costs, so owner salary, your lease costs, these things that are going to be difficult to change. And then finally, this primary variables, and these are just the kind of at a glance numbers. So this is the market individuals you're going to take to market, provided your starting value. So this is the idea is, every year you have a certain set amount of mortality, and this is what's going to happen at the end with all that mortality. Your predicted shell height, based on our modeling results from that I talked about earlier from growth, your adductor count per pound, Like I said, these are going to vary slightly, but this is just kind of giving you an idea. And then these two economic metrics, which is the run rate and the break-even price. So the run rate is basically how much you'd have to sell each pound of scallops at, or each piece of scallop, or each individual scallop throughout, uh, provided there's absolutely no debt. So you just get a beautiful scallop farm, it's set right there. It takes all the equipment costs essentially out of it. Um, the 10-year break-even price is a little bit more useful in a way because this accounts for the equipment, the cost of starting up the farm. Um, this is what you have to sell each scallop at over 10 years, and that includes the first 2 or 3 years where you're not selling scallops. You're beginning to grow them. This considers that into the equation and says that at 10 years to have $0 in your bank account, which is not ideal. This is everything you have. This is what you have to sell your scallops at. So under our assumptions that are just like preloaded, we have about $60 a pound is what you'd have to sell them at for your break-even price, and 564 a scallop for if you're selling whole. And then down here we have the minimum lease size in acres, which growers will say is kind of a difficult, is an important factor to consider. And then the amount of long lines you'd have to set up, and you'll see that in the primary inputs. So these are just really quick things you can look at to sort of play around with in the application. And then finally, we have detailed metrics. And so this detailed metrics here basically breaks down all the stuff behind the scenes in the model, and you can actually download this and say this is an Excel workbook, and it also allows you to adjust the price. So we kind of looked at this farm at a glance, and we saw that we'd have to sell each whole scallop at 564 per piece. And so we can then run this and say, I think I can sell them at $7 a piece. Run the model, it'll update, and we can see that under this economic metrics for the whole scallop, we have a net profit margin after we start selling of $217,000. And our year-end cash flow after 10 years is actually in the positive, and it goes positive at year 7, really. A note on this year-end cash flow is it doesn't consider depreciation. So depreciation in economic terms is basically it's wear and tear on the gear. The idea is this isn't a realized cost. This may not be a cost. You don't have to pay $16,000 that first year, but this is saying a lantern net has a life cycle of about 10 years. And so every year you have to set aside about 1/10 of that value, so that in 10 years you can replace that lantern net. Everything has depreciation, your vessel has depreciation, that may be 20 years. And it all goes into this, but that's not accounted for your year-end cash flow because theoretically you're not having to make those purchases. And so that's why we actually do kind of see, so if we were to put something like 565 in here, we kind of see we actually go positive in year 9, but that's just because it's not accounting for the depreciation. So, like I said, this model is designed to kind of give you a lot of mutability and a lot of just really quick and easy testing around. So, we obviously saw we couldn't make ends meet there. We have it set up for ear hanging initially for a 4-year harvest. We have our long lines at 800 feet at 60-foot depth. We're paying ourselves $60,000. We have another full-time employee at 45,000. So, initially I had the model set to 100,000 scallops, but let's see if we can make 300,000 scallops work. And so we put that in. We're going to run the farm at a glance. We're going to see that labor and maintenance go up. Our days on the water go up. Harvest is going to become a much larger proportion. But we actually see that our break-even price per pound goes down to $27.91, which isn't too bad, right? Scallops right now at a lot of the markets are selling for $35, $40 a pound. So we can go to this detailed metrics and we can actually look at this and run the model and see our net profit margins. And eventually we see that it's year 7, we get into a positive free cash flow. All right. So I'm going to take a break here and a quick breather and ask if there's anyone in here that wants to go over a specific scenario, or do you guys want to ask questions about the research? Or would you all like me to talk about my personal favorite pet scenario, which is can we make a 10,000 scallop farm profitable? And if anyone could just put in the chat, if not, I'm going to make a 10,000 scallop farm because it's my favorite thing to do.
Chris, we actually do have a question about the model. So are
Yes.
farmers able to change assumption variables such as growth rates and mortality rates, or is that kind of built in?
So the mortality rates are built in, or the growth rates are built in because they are meant as a sort of guide. Um, Once again, I forgot actually to put my email address in here, but we have this model is going to be, we're looking to get that research published, and then the model is part of that research. And that'll probably be in a few months. The model is ready to go right now, but there might be some updates and tweaks on it. But definitely, I encourage you to contact me if you want updated growth assumptions, because yeah, that's the idea is you can then you start your farm and you notice maybe you're getting better growth, maybe you're getting worse growth. You know, for instance, up here, I allow you to adjust stocking density in lantern nets if you wanted to start lantern net culture. This is actually a really powerful way to reduce the cost of a lantern net farm. But if I adjust this to 20 scallops per tier, you're going to see a reduced growth rate. Mortality, you can adjust. We have 12.5% mortality assumed across the board here. And so you can just scale this up. This is in the secondary parameters as well.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. So does anyone have any input or does anyone any questions now?
We just had another question come in, and it does sound like people want to hear about your pet 10K scallop project. So
Sweet.
that's good.
Uh, I'm glad people want to hear that because that's kind of since I started, that's kind of been the goal. You know, I worked at the Darling Marine Center, and so we talked to a lot of oyster farmers, and it seems like a lot of interest was coming from oyster farmers that wanted to have a secondary scallop farm that they just kind of wanted to see. And it's a really valuable concept, I think, a lot because of the story. So 10,000 isn't going to be your livelihood, for instance. But say you have an oyster farm and you've also developed a restaurant plan. You could maybe push these scallops to your restaurant, and it tells a really nice story of your growing sustainably harvested scallops, even if it's not your major source of income. So 10,000 scallops was kind of, I think, what I put as my ultimate goal to see if we can make this profitable. So we're just going to go through the parameters here, and I'm going to explain them. Um, and I'm hopefully going to do this in 5 minutes so that I can actually open this up for questions. So we're gonna go to the first idea, which is probably an experimental lease. We're gonna try and keep it small, um, and it's also gonna be less cost. We're gonna change our long line length down to 100 feet per long line. We're gonna say 10,000 scallops, and I think what the best way of doing this is gonna be just from my experience and my suggestion, is we're going to keep them a little small. We're going to want to sell smaller scallops, maybe like something like a kind of a cherry stone. So something, I don't know if you can see my face, but maybe 2.5, 3 inches is what we're hoping to maybe see. I'm going to keep this as ear hanging for now, just for funsies. Um, we're going to say slightly shallower. We're an oyster farm, and the long lines of sediment depth is going to be at 5 feet. Um, we're just going to consider this a sunk cost, I think. So we're going to maybe like allocate, say, $20,000 for our time and just get rid of that full-time employee. And we have a part-time wage here, so some of these tasks rely on part-time help, and we're going to reduce that as well. Like I said, and we're going to say we own a scallop farm or an oyster farm already, so the insurance is paid through by that, and the consumables are paid to that. I'm making a lot of assumptions, but like I said, the whole point of this is that you as a uh, a grower are able to kind of make these assumptions yourself. So down here we have this large initial expenditures. We're also going to assume that we have a boat. So we don't need to pay for a boat. We don't need to pay for a truck. And we don't need to pay for miscellaneous equipment. All right. So we've got all this. I'm going to run this model and let's knock on wood and hope that it works. All right. So we ran the model and we find that it's not going to be that profitable. We see this pretty hefty level of equipment expenditure here because we're ear hanging, right? So we've put a lot of money in, and we see we actually have a 3.5 inch scallop at this time period, 26 adductors per pound, and we see that we have to sell them at $8 per scallop or $203 a pound, which is not a great profit margin. We do see our labor is pretty low. That's actually not too bad. This is maybe about 25 days of labor. Our owner's salary of 20,000 is our largest fixed operating cost. That's pretty good. Depreciation is pretty high just because we have that ear hanging. Um, so we have the option here to go now into the secondary inputs. We're not going to talk a lot about wild spat collection. That's just a whole nother topic and a whole nother paper. Um, in fact, actually, let's just get rid of it. Let's just say we're not even going to collect wild spat. We have the option here to purchase spat. Let's make that simple. And we're going to purchase it at about 3.5 cents a seed. There are some commercial spat collectors out there that can sell it to you at that, I believe. Our daily work hours, we're going to say is 8 hours a day still. We're not going to adjust that. 10-tier lantern nets. But let's see in the secondary primers what else we can get rid of. And down here we have this sort of specialty equipment. We see here we're actually only selling about 5,000 or 6,000 after maybe 7,000 after all the mortality is said and done, because this is the spat you purchased is that production. But yeah, we're kind of looking at this and we're saying like, man, I do not need a $35,000 scallop washer. That's crazy. There's only 10,000 scallops. I'll just make my employees do it. They're gonna love it. Um, we're gonna say scallop grater. We probably don't need that. We can just grade by hand. Power pack. That's so you can run a lot of these things on your boat. $0. Um, but we're still going to need the pinning and depinning machine. We can get rid of this automated drill, right? I talked about how that's not going to be great at small scale farms. $0, and we're going to go with a Dremel. So about $3,000. And I think that looks good. If anyone has any comments, like I said, you're welcome to chime in. I wish this was in person so we could do that in person, but so let's see how that looks. Now this axis has changed, so it looks expensive, but it's actually not as bad as it looks. You're seeing here your seed purchase cost has kind of driven up cost there a little bit. We're seeing we get about 7,000, and now we're seeing a slightly better break-even price, 572. That's pretty nice. Run rate of 425. So if you really consider you maybe don't have to buy a lot of this equipment, maybe you already have it, you could maybe conceive of selling a $5 scallop at a restaurant, whole. But let's change it now to lantern nets and avoid having to buy that pinning and depinning machine, all the Dremel. Let's see what that looks like. And let's go to the farm at a glance. And we see now 514, man, that's still kind of expensive. But 397, we're getting down. And then finally, maybe let's just do one more thing. 2 to 3 years. I kind of like where that's at. We're gonna probably have to target a whole house. Let's adjust the density. So we're gonna get slightly slower growth, right? We wanted about a 2.5, 3 inch scallop. So let's just say at our intermediate stocking density, which is like that 1 to 2 years, we're gonna stock it at 50. So we now have reduced that lantern net load by half, and we're gonna stock here at 30 for grow out. So we're gonna get reduced growth. We're not gonna see the same growth figure, but we also are getting a slightly bigger scallop than we anticipated. And so let's reduce these lantern nets down to we're reducing about 10,000 pounds. And there we go. Now we have about 463. It's not perfect, 376, but it's getting there. We're getting to this sort of profitable scallop farm margin. Maybe I could even adjust this 20,000 figure. And so this is the idea. I mean, it's an app-based thing. It's almost like a game was the goal we kind of had in mind. So, maybe give it to your kids at home and say, hey, make me a profitable scallop farm. And maybe we even adjust it. I said 10,000, but let's say 15 because we actually want to sell 10,000. Already I'm beginning to walk back that 10,000. And there we go. We've kind of created what I like to think might be a semi-profitable scallop farm. We have this 10-year break-even price of $1.59. You sell a high end at a high end, you sell at your market 5 scallops for $25. So maybe we're selling them for 250 a whole scallop. We run this model and we see we're not making our net profit isn't necessarily making us rich, but it is giving us a really cool thing to draw people into the restaurant. And we're seeing a net profit margin of about $13,000 a year, and we're in the positive after 4 years. And so that's kind of the goal of the model. Thank you for following me through my little project of making that 10,000 scallop farm, which, yeah, 10,600 is what we're selling. All right. So I kind of went a little over there, but does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, we have a couple questions in the chat here. So you've spoken to this a little bit, but we had a question specifically about the price of selling scallops and whether you could fetch like a premium price for a line-grown scallop based on kind of like the sustainability, novelty of it all.
So I would say yes, you can. But this is the caveat I always have to put in here is thankfully I don't have the hardest job. The growers have the hardest job, which is trying to market it. I'm not a marketing person, and so I think it's about the story you tell. And I think that very well could fetch a premium price, most definitely. I think right now what we're seeing, just kind of what I've noticed, is the whole scallop market selling anywhere between $2 and $5 a scallop, depending on the price. Keep in mind those premium scallops. In Japan, I think one of the Japanese researchers I was talking to said they sell some of their scallops for about $10 to $15 for like very large, 6, 7 inch scallops. And one of those is basically a whole meal. But I think 2 to 5, especially at small scale, as long as you're not looking to like grow 500,000 of those, is pretty doable. For the adductors, I think at a farmer's market, you could definitely fetch $40 and up a pound, especially telling that story, like I said.
Nice. Yeah. And then our last question that we have in the chat right now. So please fire any more last minute questions to Chris. But this is more of a question on like startup costs. So were there like lease fees and everything kind of like tied into like your startup costs of a scallop farm there? I think you
Yeah,
shared that.
absolutely. So that's kind of this lease type here. It actually, if you hover
Yeah.
over it,
Oh,
it'll tell you
awesome.
kind of what the costs are. And like I said, this model, I plan to update it at least for the next 2, 3 years with any sort of new fees that come in. Um, but yeah, this if you select it, this will actually reduce your costs, your startup costs as well. And like I said, feel free to contact me. I'm really interested in seeing this industry grow, even though I've kind of moved on. And so I'm more than happy to kind of, as long as, I don't get hundreds of requests, but I imagine I'm only going to get like 2 or 3 people emailing me. I'm more than happy to kind of work with you, if you're looking to sort of customize this model just for yourself. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, do you
Yeah.
want to like throw your email in the chat there so people can
Yeah.
have it if they want it?
Yeah. Two. I hope this is it. It's going to be, sorry, one second.
Yeah, no worries. And while you're doing that, I just want to do a quick wrap up and let some people know about the other kind of opportunities we have going on here in the next month at MAIC. So in case you'd like to rewatch or share this presentation, we will be uploading this webinar to our YouTube channel, which you can just find by like searching MAIC, Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center on YouTube. And our next webinar is going to be, they're coming back in 2025. So our next webinar will be on Friday, January 17th. So keep an eye on our social media feeds for that. And then we also wanted to let you guys know about 2 opportunities that are coming up, and we will put both of these links in the chat for you. Yeah, there we go. Maya has thrown them in there. So if this awesome presentation has inspired you to start your own scallop farm or any other type of aquaculture farm, we have registration open now for Aquaculture in Shared Waters 1.0. So this is a 4-month training program that covers the basics of shellfish and seaweed farming and is really designed to support people interested in starting their own aquaculture businesses in Maine. So kind of awesome complement to what Chris has just presented here. And registration is also now open for the Maine Aquaculture R&D&E Summit, which will be held on Thursday, January 9th at Maine Maritime Academy. This year's summit is specifically focusing on the challenges and opportunities presented by changing climate and how our industry is adapting to that. So check our website. We have the links in the chat. And there's also a small travel and registration reimbursement. So check if you're eligible on our website for that. So I think that's all we have for today. Thank you everyone for joining us and happy holidays from all of us at MAIC.